Thanks for tuning in to Crazy Mango Stories. Give a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell for more betrayal stories. Mark Ellison leaned back in his chair, savoring the fleeting peace of a Sunday morning in his penthouse. The sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a golden glow on the polished marble floor and the sprawling cityscape beyond. Laura, his wife, was setting the dining table with her usual precision, her movements graceful and practiced after years of hosting the kind of brunches that cemented their social standing. Chloe, their daughter, breathed in from her bedroom, her phone in hand and a radiant smile that had always been her most disarming weapon. At 22, Chloe was everything Mark had hoped for in a daughter. Her wit, charm, and intellect reflected the elite education he had spared no expense to provide. She was the kind of young woman who turned heads wherever she went. Polished, poised, and perfect, at least on the surface. Chloe greeted him with a peck on the cheek before sitting at the table, her phone never leaving her hand. The brunch began like any other. Mark recounted anecdotes from the week, stories about the negotiations he had masterfully steered, the deals he had closed, and the employees he had mentored. Chloe chimed in occasionally, laughing at his jokes and offering snippets about her social life. Though Mark noticed she was more distracted than usual, her phone buzzed incessantly, a relentless stream of notifications that seemed to bring an uncharacteristic flush to her cheeks. Finally, Mark couldn't help but ask, "Who's got you so excited this morning?" His voice was teasing, but the undercurrent of curiosity was unmistakable. Chloe's smile faltered for just a second, a flicker so brief Mark might have missed it had he not been watching her so closely. "Oh, it's just a friend," she replied, her tone light but evasive. She placed her phone face down on the table, a gesture that only deepened Mark's curiosity. He could see Laura casting a sidelong glance at Chloe, but saying nothing, her diplomatic silence a skill honed over years of marriage. Mark let the moment pass. Chloe was an adult, after all, and entitled to her privacy. Yet, as the day wore on, the exchange lingered in his mind. He replayed the moment in his head, dissecting Chloe's expression and tone. It wasn't like her to be cagey. She had always been open with him, confiding in him about her dreams and fears, seeking his advice on everything from her academic pursuits to the inevitable dilemmas of young adulthood. The first crack appeared later that evening. Mark was reviewing a quarterly report in his home office when Chloe's laughter echoed from the living room. Curious, he wandered out to find her sprawled on the sofa, her phone pressed to her ear. She was animated, her face lit with an excitement he hadn't seen in years. "No, it's perfect," she was saying. "He'll never suspect a thing." Mark froze in the hallway, his heart skipping a beat. He didn't like eavesdropping, but the words sent a chill down his spine. Chloe's tone was conspiratorial, her laughter carrying a note of something unfamiliar, something calculated. Before he could process what he'd heard, Chloe ended the call and spotted him. "Det!" she exclaimed, her smile as bright as ever but tinged with surprise. "What's up?" Mark shook his head, forcing a smile. "Just stretching my legs, don't stay up too late." As he walked back to his office, unease settled over him. Chloe's sudden secrecy and that cryptic phone call stirred a nagging suspicion he couldn't shake. For the first time, he wondered if the daughter he had placed on a pedestal might have a side he didn't know, a side that could shatter the image of the perfect daughter. The sun was just breaking through the haze over the city skyline when Mark Ellison received the call that shifted his world. It was from Ian Stratton, his chief operating officer at Axion Freight. Ian's voice, usually calm and measured, had a tense edge. "We've got a problem," Ian began. "It's big. I think you need to hear this in person." By the time Mark arrived at the Axion headquarters, his nerves were wound tight. Ian met him in the executive conference room, sliding a thick folder across the polished mahogany table. "We've had leaks," Ian said grimly. "Competitors are underbidding us on key contracts, hitting clients with exactly the offers they can't refuse. They know too much. pricing models, routes, even our client acquisition strategies. Mark flipped through the documents, his heart pounding as he saw evidence of systematic sabotage. Contracts lost to Damian Alvarez's rival firm, Nexus Logistics. The timing was too precise to be a coincidence. "This isn't luck," Mark said coldly. "Someone inside Axion is feeding them intel." Ian nodded. "That's the only explanation, and they're hitting us where it hurts." The idea of betrayal within Axion Freight was unthinkable to Mark. He had cultivated an environment of loyalty and trust, treating his employees as family. But the cracks were undeniable, and Mark knew he had to act quickly before more damage was done. "Do we have any leads?" Mark asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Ian hesitated. "We're looking into it. But whoever it is, they're careful. They're covering their tracks." Mark dismissed Ian, but the conversation left him shaken. He locked the door to his office and leaned back in his chair, letting his mind churn through the possibilities. Who could have access to this kind of information? Who had the motive? His first thought was Laura, his wife. In recent months, she had grown distant, her aloofness unsettling in ways he couldn't quite pinpoint. But as he considered it, the thought of Chloe drifted to the forefront of his mind. It seemed absurd at first. Chloe, his beloved daughter, betraying him. But her recent behavior, the evasive answers, and her newfound attachment to her phone flashed through his thoughts like warning signs. No, Mark thought firmly, she wouldn't. And yet, the unease persisted. The following day, Mark received another blow. A meeting with a long-standing client went south when the client revealed they had signed with Nexus Logistics due to a better-suited proposal. Mark pressed them for details, but they clammed up. Back at the office, Ian brought him more evidence. Ian brought him a canceled lunch and intercepted messages that confirmed insider leaks. That evening, after Laura went to bed, Mark found himself standing outside Chloe's bedroom door. He hesitated, feeling guilty even as his hand reached for the doorknob. She wasn't home, so he entered. Her room was pristine, just as he'd expected, but a sense of unease tugged at him as he scanned the space. It was too perfect, as though carefully curated to mask something. In the back of her closet, hidden beneath a row of carefully arranged shoes, Mark found a small pile of shopping bags. The logos were from high-end brands, ones he didn't recognize Chloe as favoring. His stomach tightened as he rifled through them, uncovering a receipt that stopped him cold. A Porsche, recently purchased in Chloe's name. The buyer? Damian Alvarez. Mark's breath caught in his throat. Alvarez wasn't just a rival. He was the man who had been systematically dismantling Axion Freight, one contract at a time. And now, it seemed, he was rewarding Chloe for her assistance. For several minutes, Mark sat on the edge of Chloe's bed, the receipt clutched in his trembling hand. A storm of disbelief and betrayal roared through him, battling with a desperate desire for an alternative explanation. But there wasn't one. Chloe, his daughter, was working with the enemy. The next morning, Mark confronted Ian. "I want surveillance," he said bluntly. "My house. My daughter. I want to know who she's meeting and what she's telling them." Ian's face betrayed his discomfort, but he nodded. "I'll handle it." Within days, the private investigator Mark hired delivered results. Chloe was meeting Damian Alvarez at an upscale downtown hotel. She wasn't subtle. In the surveillance footage, she handed over files that could only have come from Mark's office. Chloe's laugh echoed faintly through the audio as she leaned closer to Damian, the two sharing drinks and a sense of camaraderie that made Mark's stomach churn. "You don't know my dad," Chloe was recorded saying. "He's always 5 steps ahead. Except when it comes to me, he'll never suspect a thing." The betrayal hit Mark like a blow to the chest. The daughter he had poured his heart and soul into raising, the girl he had once thought would carry his legacy, was instead dismantling it, piece by piece. That evening, Mark sat alone in his study, the weight of his daughter's betrayal pressing down on him. He poured himself a drink, but the whiskey offered no solace. Instead, his mind turned to strategy. Chloe's disloyalty wasn't just personal, it was war. And Mark Ellison didn't lose wars. Mark Ellison wasn't a man who panicked under pressure. Years of managing crises had honed his ability to stay focused and decisive, even when his instincts screamed otherwise. But as he sat in Chloe's room that night, staring at the receipt with Damian Alvarez's name on it, he felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest, a combination of heartbreak and fury. He couldn't confront Chloe, not yet. The stakes were too high, and Mark had learned long ago that timing was everything. He needed more evidence, a strategy, and most importantly, clarity about the depth of her betrayal. The following morning, Mark drove to the office, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, as if it were the only thing tethering him to reality. The city blurred around him as he replayed the scenes in his mind. Chloe's cryptic behavior, her nervous laugh, and the damning receipt. It wasn't enough to accuse her. Mark needed irrefutable proof, and he knew where to start. By the time Mark arrived at his private office, Ian Stratton was already there, reviewing security reports from the past month. "Ian," Mark said, his voice sharp, "we're not just dealing with leaks. This is espionage." Ian looked up, startled. "What do you mean?" Mark hesitated, weighing how much to share. "Someone close to me, very close, is involved. I need a full sweep of the house. Computers, tablets, phones. I also want a deeper dive in Alvarez's recent moves. Who's working with him? Who's feeding him? And most importantly, how is he getting so close?" Ian nodded, his expression grim. "I'll mobilize the team immediately. But Mark, if this is personal, it could get messy." Mark's jaw tightened. It already is. That evening, Mark sat in the living room, pretending to read the latest financial report while Laura chatted about an upcoming charity event. Chloe was unusually quiet, her head bent over her phone. Every now and then, she'd glance at the screen, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Mark's pulse quickened. He forced himself to appear uninterested, but his mind raced. Was she texting Alvarez? Another accomplice? A client she had helped steal? The possibilities churned in his head until Laura interrupted his thoughts. "Mark, are you listening?" she asked, her tone slightly irritated. He looked up, feigning surprise. "Sorry, work's been hectic." Laura sighed and turned back to her glass of wine, muttering something about always being married to his job. Chloe didn't even look up, her attention glued to her phone. 2 days later, the private investigator returned with more evidence. Mark met him at a discreet downtown cafe, the kind of place where business titans mingled without drawing too much attention. The investigator slid a folder across the table. "I think you'll find this illuminating," he said. Mark opened the folder with steady hands, but his stomach churned as he scanned the photos. There was Chloe at a high-end boutique, laughing with a sales associate as Damian stood nearby, a credit card in hand. In another, she was seated in the back of a Porsche, her expression smug as Damian leaned toward her, speaking animatedly. But it wasn't just the photos. The investigator had pulled financial records that revealed a troubling pattern. Damian wasn't just spoiling Chloe with luxury goods. He was funneling money into an account under her name. The sums were substantial, enough to make Mark realize this wasn't just a flirtation or a misguided rebellion. This was calculated. The final piece was a recording from the boutique. Chloe's voice was clear, almost unrecognizable in its tone. "Mark's been expanding into international routes," she said casually. "If you push Nexus into Europe, he won't see it coming." Mark's blood ran cold. Chloe wasn't just feeding Damian information, she was actively helping him sabotage Axion. Back at home, Mark began his own investigation. He waited until Laura and Chloe were both out before accessing Chloe's laptop, which he knew she rarely used but still kept in her room. To his surprise, she hadn't even bothered to password protect it. What he found was both shocking and infuriating. Email exchanges with Damien revealed a months-long collaboration. Um, Chloe had been providing him with sensitive Axion documents, including client lists and pricing structures. In return, Damien lavished her with gifts, praise, and promises of a glamorous life outside the shadow of her father. One email in particular caught Mark's attention. Damien, Bark's working on a new logistics deal with Far East Corp. If you can undercut him there, it'll cripple his expansion plans. Let me know what else you need. Mark clenched his fists as he read and reread the message. She had even signed it with her initial, as if to flaunt her involvement. He saved the emails to an encrypted drive, careful not to leave any trace of his access. As the days passed, Mark couldn't help but study Chloe more closely. Every laugh, every glance at her phone, every casual remark seemed to hold a double meaning. She was always so composed, her behavior as polished as the image she presented to the world. But now, Mark saw the cracks. Her smile seemed forced, her confidence tinged with arrogance. She truly believed she was untouchable. One evening, Mark decided to test her. Over dinner, he casually mentioned a new deal Axion was pursuing, a fabricated partnership with a company that didn't exist. Chloe barely reacted, but Mark caught the flicker of interest in her eyes. 2 days later, Ian confirmed that Damien had begun making inquiries into the fictional deal. It was Chloe. There was no longer any doubt. But what tore at Mark the most was the question of why. Why would his daughter, the girl he had loved, protected, and supported, betray him in such a calculated way? He replayed her childhood in his mind, searching for clues he might have missed. Had he worked too much? Was he too hard on her? Or was this just who she was, a girl seduced by wealth and power, willing to sell her loyalty for a designer bag and a shiny car? One night, Mark confronted Laura, though he carefully avoided revealing everything he knew. "Have you noticed anything different about Chloe?" he asked. Laura frowned, setting down her glass of wine. "She's been spending a lot lately. I just assumed she was tapping into her trust fund." Mark's heart sank. "She has a trust fund?" "Of course," Laura said, surprised. "You set it up when she turned 18. Mark said nothing, his mind spinning. The trust fund wasn't the issue. He had always intended to provide for Chloe, but the idea that she was draining it to fuel her betrayal stung deeply. It wasn't just about the money. It was about what it symbolized. Mark's strategy began to take shape that night. He wouldn't confront Chloe immediately. That would give her the upper hand, allow her to spin her lies and excuses. Instead, he would use her own overconfidence against her, feeding her false information that would ultimately bring Damien to his knees. The game was on, and Mark Ellison was ready to play. But as he stared out at the glittering city skyline, he couldn't shake the ache in his chest. He had always believed family was his greatest strength. Now, he realized it might also be his greatest weakness. Mark Ellison's plan was underway, but executing it required precision. Damien Alvarez was cunning, but his overconfidence and Chloe's naivety made them vulnerable. To bring them down, Mark needed to stay one step ahead. He started by controlling the flow of information. In the weeks following his discovery of Chloe's betrayal, Mark began feeding her carefully curated, sensitive details about Axion Freight's operations. Contracts for non-existent deals, fake pricing models, and bogus client lists were slipped into documents he left strategically accessible. Chloe, unaware of the trap, eagerly absorbed the information and passed it to Damien. Mark monitored every step through surveillance, his fury hardening into resolve as he saw the extent of her betrayal. The first false lead Mark planted was an exclusive contract with a shipping conglomerate supposedly interested in Axion's Southeast Asia expansion. Mark created a trail of fake emails, boardroom discussions, and confidential files that detailed lucrative terms and tight deadlines. He casually mentioned the deal during a family dinner, ensuring Chloe overheard. "Whoa, that's a big move, Dad," she said, trying to sound indifferent as she reached for the salad. Mark nodded, keeping his tone light. "It's risky, but if it works, it'll solidify our presence in the region." He didn't miss the way Chloe's fork paused midair, or how her eyes flickered with interest. She excused herself moments later, retreating to her room. Later, Ian confirmed what Mark already suspected. Chloe had sent Damien every fabricated detail about the supposed contract. 2 weeks later, Damien acted. Nexus Logistics publicly announced a rival expansion into Southeast Asia, undercutting Axion with a lower bid. But when the conglomerate denied any knowledge of a deal, Damien's plan began to unravel. Investors and industry leaders questioned his decision, and Nexus suffered its first major financial setback in years. Mark observed it all with grim satisfaction. It wasn't enough to bring Damien down completely, but it rattled him. More importantly, it confirmed the depth of Chloe's involvement. But Mark didn't stop there. He had noticed how Chloe met Damien regularly at upscale hotels and restaurants, their rendezvous timed perfectly to avoid suspicion. What they didn't realize was that Mark's investigator had bugged their meeting spots. Every whispered conversation, every laugh, every boast was recorded. One such recording made Mark's blood boil. "You're a natural at this," Damien told Chloe during a dinner at a Michelin-starred restaurant. His voice dripped with admiration. "Mark's lucky to have you in his corner." "Too bad he doesn't realize how lucky." Chloe laughed softly. "He thinks I'm still his little princess. That's what makes this so easy." The words were a dagger to Mark's heart, but he steeled himself. Emotion couldn't cloud his judgment. The second phase of Mark's plan targeted Damien's financial operations. Nexus Logistics had always been aggressive, but Mark knew that Damien's ambition often led him to cut corners. Using the fake information Chloe provided, Damien began making large-scale investments and signing dubious contracts, deals that Mark's team ensured were unsustainable. By the time Damien realized he had overextended Nexus, it was too late. Investors grew restless, and Nexus's board of directors began questioning Damien's leadership. Rumors of incompetence spread, and competitors exploited his vulnerabilities. Mark watched Damien squirm from a distance, his moves calculated and deliberate. But it wasn't enough. Chloe still hadn't realized the depth of the trap she was in. One evening, Mark called a meeting with his legal and financial advisors. It was held in a private suite at the Carlton Hotel, far from Axion's headquarters. Ian, who had been instrumental in executing Mark's counter-strategy, presented the next phase. "We've traced Damien's offshore accounts," Ian explained. "He's been funneling money to shell corporations under Chloe's name. On paper, it looks like she's a major investor in Nexus." Mark felt his stomach turn. Damien wasn't just using Chloe as a messenger, he was making her complicit in his crimes. "What happens if this comes to light?" Mark asked, though he already knew the answer. Ian hesitated. It could be considered corporate espionage. If Nexus collapses, Chloe could be implicated. Legally." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Mark clenched his fists, his mind racing. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about protecting his daughter from her own recklessness. The final phase of Mark's plan was set in motion during a high-profile industry gala. Mark knew Chloe and Damien would attend. He made sure of it by planting another piece of bait, a rumor about a merger between Axion and a major European logistics firm. Chloe had eagerly passed the fabricated details to Damien, who couldn't resist the opportunity to disrupt Mark's supposed plans. As expected, Damien arrived at the gala with Chloe on his arm, the two of them radiating confidence. Mark observed them from across the room, his expression unreadable. Laura, oblivious to the storm brewing around her, mingled with guests, her laughter filling the space. When the time was right, Mark approached Damien and Chloe. "Mr. Alvarez, he said smoothly, extending a hand. "How's business?" Damien hesitated, his confidence faltering under Mark's cold gaze. "Mark," he said, forcing a smile. "Always a pleasure." Mark turned to Chloe, his eyes betraying nothing. "Chloe, you look stunning tonight." "Thanks, Dad," she said, her voice tight. "Enjoy the evening," Mark said, his tone carrying an edge that made Damien shift uncomfortably. The climax came the following week, when Mark executed his coup de grace. Using the evidence his investigator had gathered, Mark anonymously leaked Damien's fraudulent activities to the media and regulatory authorities. The revelations were explosive. Insider trading, financial mismanagement, and questionable dealings with foreign entities. Nexus's stock plummeted overnight, and Damien became the subject of multiple investigations. Meanwhile, Mark used the opportunity to solidify Axion's position, securing contracts that Damien had been forced to abandon. But Mark wasn't done. In a final move, he froze the accounts Damien had set up under Chloe's name. When she tried to access the funds, she found herself locked out, her betrayal laid bare. Mark confronted Chloe the next evening. He laid the evidence before her, photos, emails, recordings. She tried to deny it at first, but her lies crumbled under the weight of the proof. "You sold me out," Mark said, his voice low and filled with controlled anger. "For what? A car? A few designer bags?" Chloe broke down, but her tears didn't move him. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," she whispered. "Damien said it was just business." "Business?" Mark snapped. "You jeopardized everything I've built. You jeopardized this family." Chloe sobbed, but Mark's resolve didn't waver. "You'll face the consequences of your choices," he said. "And I hope you'll remember this moment the next time someone offers you the world in exchange for your loyalty." As he left her room, Mark felt a pang of sadness. Chloe's betrayal had cut him deeply, but it also gave him clarity. Family wasn't about blood. It was about trust. And Chloe had shattered his. The moment had come for Mark Ellison to reveal the truth. Weeks of planning, deception, and cold calculation had led him here, to a family meeting in the penthouse dining room, where the betrayal would be laid bare. Mark sat at the head of the table, his expression impassive as Chloe and Laura settled into their seats. The tension in the air was palpable, though neither of them suspected the storm about to break. "I've called this meeting," Mark began, his voice steady but sharp, "because there are things that need to be said, things I can't ignore anymore." Laura exchanged a nervous glance with Chloe, who fidgeted in her chair. Mark placed a folder on the table, thick with documents that represented the unraveling of his trust and the meticulous work he had done to bring them to this moment. "You've both been lying to me," Mark said, his gaze locking first on Chloe, then on Laura. "And I know everything." Chloe's face paled. "Dad, I don't know what you're talking about." "Stop," Mark interrupted, his tone ice cold. He slid a USB drive across the table. "On this drive is all the evidence I've collected. Emails, financial transactions, surveillance footage. Do you want to keep pretending you don't know?" Chloe looked down, unable to meet his eyes. Laura shifted uncomfortably, her hand gripping the edge of the table. Mark's voice grew harsher. "You betrayed me, Chloe. You stole from this family and handed it to Damien Alvarez, a man who's tried to destroy everything I've built." "I didn't mean to," Chloe began, but Mark slammed his hand on the table, silencing her. "You didn't mean to," he repeated, his voice a sharp edge. "You've been working with him for months. You handed him confidential information, our client lists, even details of contracts I trusted you to keep private. All for what? Bags? Jewelry? A car." Chloe's tears began to fall, but Mark wasn't done. He turned to Laura. "And you, Laura, did you know about this?" Or were you too busy with your own lies? Laura froze, her face a mask of forced calm. What are you implying? Mark didn't flinch. I'm implying that while our daughter was selling me out to my competitor, you were betraying me in other ways. Do I need to spell it out? Laura's expression shifted, her composure cracking. Mark, this is ridiculous. Is it? Mark said, leaning forward, because I have proof. Do you want me to play the footage of your late-night meetings with your so-called friends? Or should I list the expenses on your credit card that don't add up? Laura looked away, her silence confirming everything Mark already knew. For a moment, the room was silent, except for the faint hum of the city below. Then Mark took a deep breath and sat back in his chair. Here's how this is going to work, he said, his voice calm but unyielding. Chloe, your accounts have been frozen. Every cent you've taken from me will be accounted for. The car? It's being repossessed as we speak. You'll be finishing your degree without a penny of my money. You're going to learn what it means to earn trust and to live without privilege. Chloe sobbed openly now, but Mark didn't stop. And Laura, I've already spoken to my lawyer. The divorce papers will be delivered tomorrow. You'll leave this house with nothing but your personal belongings. The prenup ensures that. Laura's mouth opened as if to protest, but Mark held up a hand. Don't even try to argue. You've spent years undermining me, and I've had enough. Mark stood and walked to the window, staring out at the city that had been the backdrop to his triumphs and now his betrayals. Do you know what hurts the most? He asked without turning around. It's not the money, not even the company. It's the fact that I trusted you both. I gave you everything, and in return, you destroyed it. His voice broke slightly, but he steadied himself. But I've rebuilt from nothing before, and I'll do it again, without either of you. He turned back to face them. Chloe was trembling, tears streaming down her face. Laura's expression had turned cold, her facade of innocence abandoned now that she realized there was no way out. I'll be fine, Mark said, his voice gaining strength. Axion is stronger than ever. Damian Alvarez is finished. The fake deals I fed you, Chloe, they've gutted his company. His investors are fleeing, and he's under investigation for fraud. As for you two, you've lost me, and I promise you, you'll feel that loss every day from now on. As Mark left the dining room, the weight of his words hung heavy in the air. For Chloe, the realization of her actions hit hard. She had thought she could outsmart her father, but she had underestimated him, his intelligence, his resilience, and his capacity for cold, calculated revenge. For Laura, there was only bitterness. She had gambled on Mark's obliviousness and lost spectacularly. The life she had built, the luxuries she had taken for granted, were gone. And the man she had dismissed as too trusting had proved to be far sharper than she had ever realized. In the days that followed, Mark moved forward with precision. Chloe, cut off financially, reached out to him repeatedly, begging for forgiveness, but her pleas went unanswered. Laura, meanwhile, moved out quietly, leaving behind the life she had taken for granted. Damian Alvarez faced mounting legal troubles as Mark's carefully orchestrated takedown continued to unravel his empire. Mark, however, found no joy in his victory. Late at night, in the quiet of his now empty penthouse, he allowed himself to feel the weight of the betrayal. The family he had cherished was gone, replaced by a hollow sense of justice. Yet even in his solitude, he held on to one truth. He had survived. And as the city lights twinkled below, Mark resolved to rebuild his life, not for Chloe, not for Laura, but for himself. He had won the battle, but the scars of betrayal would remain, and for Mark Ellison, that was the true cost of trust broken.